In the past few years, countries across Latin America have seen a resurgent leftist movement that has led many to believe we are seeing a revival of the Pink Tide movement from the early 2000s. This movement marked a period during which leftist parties of various ideological leanings came to power across Latin America, which attempted to implement sweeping reforms at a time when neoliberalism was really at its apex, and the winds were generally blowing in the opposite direction in terms of state power across the globe. Let's take a trip back to the 1990s. The Soviet Union had just dissolved, the United States had just become the undisputed global hegemon, and now the Washington Consensus, or more generally, America's economic recommendations for developing states, was the new status quo. This status quo exacerbated economic and social divisions across the developing world, as industries were privatized, resources sold off for cheap for little benefit to the people of these states, and austerity measures gutting social programs. In Latin America specifically, this allowed leftist movements to flourish in local and regional elections, offering an alternative to the neoliberal world order and seeking to restore worker and indigenous rights that were being rapidly encroached upon. In 1998, this movement reached the national level with the election of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who would become the foremost face of the first Pink Tide, followed by the elections of Lula de Silva in Brazil in 2003 and Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2006. These elections, among others, would lead to a cohesive regional coalition among these popular parties, with Venezuela and Cuba founding ALBA in 2004 that would bridge the gap between the old left and the new left in Latin America. The original Pink Tide waned and crashed when most of these parties were either elected out of power or couped, or even in cases where they remained in power, they saw a loss of optimism with events such as the death of Hugo Chavez, the death of Fidel Castro, the eventual arrest of Lula on corruption charges, which were later overturned, and the coup of Bolivian President Evo Morales in 2019. This downturn was caused by a variety of problems, such as the aforementioned coups, but in all honesty, the electoral failures or lack of popular support were largely caused by these parties, upon achieving power, not fully carrying out their stated agendas, whether this be willing or unwilling in cases where perhaps other forces within the state apparatus stop them at every turn. It is important to note the cases where these parties were unsuccessful in satisfying the desires of their people, though, because this is fundamental in understanding the sustainability of the left-wing movement in the region today. Despite this, in the wake of a decade of downturn, it seems that the people of Latin America were awoken by all of this turmoil, and popular resistance began to re-spark the movement across the continent. Starting with the election of center-left to left-wing parties in Mexico and Argentina, followed by resistance to the coup in Bolivia and the eventual election of Evo's party back to power, rapidly leftist parties across South and Central America were being brought back to power, such as in Colombia, Peru, Honduras, Nicaragua, Chile, among several others, and most recently Brazil with the election of Lula last year. This resurgence has repopularized many of the policies from this Pink Tide era, while also notably correcting some of the errors of this first movement. This new wave has put a large focus on indigenous rights and protections, opposition to neoliberalism and austerity, regionalism, and opposition to foreign intervention in national affairs. This is in stark opposition to the policies of right-wing politicians and parties in these same countries, often holding the exact opposite views, such as anti-indigenous policies, privatization and deregulation of industries, stark austerity measures, the usual toolbox of such parties. The first Pink Tide fell apart largely because the parties involved did not use the power at their disposal to fully carry out their policies, both out of a sense of legal moralism, but also out of a reasonable fear of international pushback, a very real fear that materialized in the example of Venezuela. I'll discuss what needs to be done in order to prevent this from happening again in just a bit, But first, let's look at the regional and international implications of this movement. One key achievement of the movement overall was the creation of the Sao Paulo Forum. While the forum hosts parties and organizations both in and outside of power, each country that we consider to be a part of this trend is a member. And at present moment, the forum is at the height of its membership. Additionally, ALBA is a more integrated regional organization between the further left states like Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia, but also several other smaller Caribbean states. ALBA notably delves into some more trade-related integration agreements. States included in this new pink tide are notably friendly with one another and demonstrate an admirable level of regional coordination and cooperation, speaking to the power of ideological solidarity, especially in this context of periphery countries. Because of this shift, the states involved have become more and more independent in the international context. Because of the abundance of resources in many of these states, they are also very competitive in the international economic sphere, which has led to global leaders taking large steps to try and become friendly with these countries. The US, who certainly has a very bad track record in Latin America, and who even until recently was, admittedly very badly, attempting to organize coups in Venezuela, Bolivia, so on, have recently put aside their disdain for leftist leaders in these states in order to acquire much needed resources such as oil and lithium in the wake of the loss of these after the sanctions imposed on Russia. China has also been investing heavily into building good relations with these states, attempting to incorporate them into China's New Silk Road program, which is a larger component to the Belt and Road Initiative. The membership of Brazil in BRICS, additionally, will likely be strengthened under Lula, giving Brazil a larger global role and a leadership role among emerging economies. All in all, Latin America is in a prime position to assert itself internationally this decade, and build strong relations with like-minded states across the globe. But in order to preserve this position, the parties in this movement need to learn from past mistakes before these gains are reversed. The main matter at hand for these countries is that in order to maintain these newly gained advantages and political victories, they need to avoid the mistakes that were made in the past 20 years. The main weakness of these states is that because of the electoral manner in which they achieve power, they are subject to the same institutions that are often inherently oppositional to them, which is why it is so easy for these governments to get couped by their militaries or ousted by bureaucrats and regional officials, who will almost certainly use illegal, forceful, and non-electoral means to maintain their own power if they are strong enough. It's the issue that popular parties face worldwide, but in these cases where they can actually achieve power through elections, they are still facing opposition from reactionary forces in other elements of the state. In order to avoid these forces, these governments absolutely need to utilize state power to root out these elements and force them out of the state apparatus. Until this is done, we aren't even close to being able to celebrate the victories of these parties as a definitive win. The prime example of this necessity is the tragedy of Pedro Castillo, the now former president of Peru, whose short term in power was marked by controversy, with near constant changes in government, opposition from other branches of government, his attempt to dissolve the national legislature, and his subsequent removal from power and current imprisonment. While his reasoning for doing this is arguably justified, especially given that the previous two presidents have been ousted by a rather reactionary Congress, the result shows that this move was very poorly thought out, as he had lost all power, and now the entire state apparatus of Peru lies in the hands of his opponents. Since his imprisonment, Peru has been in a state of unrest and mass protest, and at the time of me writing this, 69 civilians are confirmed dead, with over 1,600 more injured and over 600 arrested. In this example, the attempt to use state power on Castillo's behalf was done with very little support from anyone in the state apparatus, resulting in his total loss of power. On January 8th of this year, the Brazilian legislative building was attacked by supporters of the losing presidential candidate and Publix enjoyer Bolsonaro. These attackers, in typical reactionary congressional building raiding fashion, wandered around for a bit, destroyed public property, and generally caused havoc with basically no goals in mind, but still attacking government power nonetheless. Leading up to this attack, there were rumors that the military, which has a history of shutting down Brazil's elections and ruling instead, would similarly prevent this election. When it didn't, the rumors and hopes of Bolsonaro supporters was that they simply wouldn't allow Lula to take power. But when he did, the legislature was raided in the hopes that this would cause the military to finally join in. However, when the military and police arrived on scene to the cheers of the crowd, the attack was promptly shut down, with many in attendance being arrested, around 1,400 people to be exact, which I just wanted to point out is absolutely hilarious that they were clapping up until the moment they were literally getting handcuffed. In the aftermath, Lula placed state officials that he held partially responsible for the lack of preparedness and has been cracking down on decidedly pro-Bolsonaro and anti-electoral forces in and outside of the government. This is definitely the right track, and it gives some hope that Brazil won't fall under the same fate that Bolivia and Peru have seen in recent years. However, as we've seen, the reactionary forces inside of these governments are very strong, and it will likely take much more to avoid the scheming of these groups. The main takeaway here is that these leaders simply need to cement state power in a way that their opponents would and have historically done. There's a common idea that these leaders need to be better than their opposition morally, but this simply won't help when it comes to the overwhelming amount of resistance that they face. If they can maintain their power, however, South America seems to be headed down a very bright path that may finally lift the region out of many of the issues it has faced for centuries. So I know this one was a bit of a shorter one, especially compared to the last video, but I was working on this while I had midterms, so I still wanted to get something out, and I hope that it was still informative. I'm already working on the next couple of videos, so those will be out soon. I just wanted to thank everyone who went and watched the last video. The response to that was very positive, and it made me feel much more confident about making these videos, so thank you for that. Go ahead and watch it if you haven't already. Make sure to like this video and let me know what you think. See you in the next one.